Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're going deep today, really deep into the world of Andy Kaufman.
A true comedic legend.
Totally. But his career, well, it wasn't exactly conventional, was it?
Not at all.
So to help us understand, I guess, his unique approach to comedy, we're going to be looking at it through a specific lens.
The Enneagram.
Yeah.
Specifically, the sexual 7 subtype.
No, hold on. If you are not familiar with the Enneagram, no worries.
We'll explain.
We'll explain everything as we go, I promise. But basically, think of it as this system of personality typing.
9 interconnected types.
Right.
Each with its own, set of core motivations and fears.
Exactly. And the sexual 7, sometimes called the enchanter, is characterized by a deep desire for, exciting experiences.
And a constant need to avoid pain and boredom.
Yes.
They are often described as charismatic, spontaneous, and imaginative.
Oh, totally.
But also prone to impulsiveness and a fear of missing out.
And, when you think about Andy Kaufman's career, it's almost like he was like a textbook example of a sexual 7 in action.
Yeah.
For example, one of the hallmarks of this type is a tendency to kind of blur the lines between reality and fantasy.
Right.
Creating these elaborate, almost like mythical personas.
And Kaufman took that to a whole new level.
He really did.
I mean, think about his most famous character, Tony Clifton.
Oh, yeah.
He didn't just play Clifton. He insisted that Clifton was a real person,
Oh, yeah.
even having friends portray him while Kaufman himself was visibly elsewhere.
Yeah. He even had a separate contract, for Clifton, written into his agreement for the show Taxi,
It's wild.
which I have to say is pretty wild. What do you make of that kind of commitment to a persona, especially when it seems to go so far beyond the realm of traditional acting?
Well, I think for Kaufman, it wasn't just about acting. It was about creating an experience, a world where the lines between, reality and performance were completely blurred. And for a sexual 7, that kind of immersive experience, that sense of, playing with perception and pushing boundaries is incredibly alluring.
So it's almost like he was, challenging the audience.
Yeah.
Daring them to figure out what was real and what was an act. And I think that's part of what made him so captivating. You never knew what to expect.
Right.
And you couldn't help but be drawn into his world.
Exactly. And that sense of unpredictability, of
Yeah.
constantly keeping the audience on their toes, that's another classic sexual 7
Yeah.
trait.
Yeah.
They have this incredible energy, this need for novelty that makes them incredibly engaging performers.
And it wasn't just Clifton, right? I mean, Kaufman did this with a lot of his characters and performances,
Yeah.
even his wrestling career.
Absolutely. I mean, think about his self-proclaimed title, Intergender Wrestling Champion of the World.
I love that.
Fabricated storylines, staged elaborate feuds, even fooled the entire wrestling world with his commitment to the bit.
I mean, his years-long feud with Jerry Lawler was pure genius, really.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is that even though these performances were clearly staged, there was always this underlying question of, is he really serious? It was like he was intentionally blurring those lines between performance and reality.
Yeah.
And that just made it all the more compelling.
And that's where the sexual 7's capacity for self-suggestion comes into play.
Okay.
They can become so immersed in their own fantasies,
Mm-mm.
so convinced of their own narratives,
Yeah.
that it becomes difficult to distinguish between, what's real and what's imagined.
So in a way, Kaufman wasn't just entertaining the audience. He was inviting them to participate in this shared delusion, right? This
Yeah.
world where anything was possible.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that's a powerful thing, especially for a comedian.
Yeah.
Because when you can get the audience to, suspend their disbelief,
Yeah.
to buy into your world, then you can take them anywhere.
Okay, so we've talked about this blurring of reality and fantasy, this need for novelty and excitement. But there's another aspect of the sexual 7 that I find really fascinating, and that's their aversion to routine and the mundane.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Sexual 7s crave stimulation, new experiences,
Right.
and they have a real difficulty with anything that feels repetitive or boring.
And this definitely played out in Kaufman's career choices, didn't it?
Yeah.
Even with Taxi, a hugely successful show,
Right.
he wasn't content with just playing the role and collecting a paycheck.
He had it written into his contract that he would only appear in 14 episodes per season.
Wow.
And there's this great quote from him where he says, he's not a comedian, but a song and dance man.
I love that.
It's like he was resisting being categorized, being put in a box, because that would have felt too limiting, too predictable.
It's almost like he was allergic to success, at least in the traditional sense.
Yeah.
As soon as something started to feel too comfortable, too routine,
Right.
he'd move on to something else.
It's that fear of missing out. of being trapped in a situation that doesn't offer enough, like, stimulation or excitement.
Yeah,
And it's a powerful motivator for sexual sevens.
right,
It can lead them to constantly seek out new experiences, new challenges,
right.
even if it means sacrificing stability or success.
Which, when you think about it, is incredibly risky, especially in a field like entertainment where consistency is often seen as key.
And that's what makes Kaufman so intriguing. He took these core traits of the sexual seven, these qualities that could be seen as liabilities in a conventional career,
Mm.
and he turned them into assets.
Oh, totally.
He embraced his impulsiveness, his need for novelty, his desire to challenge expectations,
Yeah.
and he used them to create a truly unique and unpredictable comedic style.
It's like he was constantly pushing the boundaries of what was considered acceptable, even what was considered funny.
Yeah.
He was willing to make people uncomfortable, to confuse them, to challenge their assumptions about what comedy should be.
And that's a hallmark of the sexual seven's tendency for verbal performance.
Okay.
It's not just about telling jokes. It's about using language to create an experience, to provoke a reaction, to challenge the status quo.
And Kaufman was a master of this.
Yeah.
Think about his foreign man character.
Oh, yeah.
Those seemingly endless monologues,
Right.
the pointless stories, the awkward silences.
Yeah.
He'd just keep talking and talking, and somehow it was mesmerizing.
Right.
You knew he was messing with you, but you couldn't help but be drawn in by the sheer absurdity of it all.
You were never quite sure if he was being intentionally funny or if he was just genuinely odd.
Right.
But either way, it was impossible to ignore him.
It's like he was playing a game with the audience, and the rules were constantly changing.
Right.
And that's what made him so brilliant. He took the familiar, the expected, and he turned it on its head.
Yeah.
He made you question everything, even your own sense of humor.
It's a remarkable thing, really.
Yeah.
And it speaks to the power of the sexual work.
Mm.
A seven's need to be different, to stand out, to be the center of attention.
So how did this play out in Kaufman's career? Because it seems like he wasn't content with just being a comedian.
Yeah.
He wanted to be something more, something bigger.
Well, for one thing, there's his foray into professional wrestling.
Oh, yeah.
He didn't just want to be a wrestler. He declared himself the intergender wrestling champion of the world.
I love that.
This wasn't just a bid. It was a full-blown performance art piece that took on a life of its own.
And it wasn't just about the wrestling itself. It was
Wow.
about the spectacle, the drama, the blurring of lines between reality and fiction.
Yeah.
He was creating this whole mythology around himself, this larger-than-life persona that captivated the public.
And that's where the sexual seven's tendency for grandiosity and exhibition comes in.
Okay.
They have this innate desire to be seen, to be recognized, to be admired.
Yeah.
And they're often drawn to activities or professions that allow them to express that need on a grand scale.
And Kaufman definitely wasn't afraid of the spotlight. In fact, he seemed to thrive on it. The more attention he got, the more outrageous his performances became. It's like he was constantly trying to outdo himself, to create something even bigger, even more shocking than what came before.
And that brings us to one of the most iconic examples of Kaufman's grandiosity. His performance at Carnegie Hall.
Oh my gosh, yes.
I mean, if you want to see a sexual seven in full flight, this is it.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like a masterclass in pushing boundaries, exceeding expectations, and creating a truly unforgettable experience. I mean, where do you even begin with that performance?
I know.
It had everything. Robin Williams disguised as his grandmother, a staged heart attack, a resurrection, taking the whole audience out for milk and cookies, and then inviting them all to meet him on Staten Island the next morning.
It's almost too much to process.
It is.
But that's the beauty of it, right?
It is.
It's like a whirlwind of absurdity, a celebration of the unexpected, a testament to the power of, imagination and performance to create a truly unique and shared experience.
It's like he was saying, I can do anything. I can be anyone. And I'm going to take you all on this wild ride with me.
Yeah.
And the audience, well, they were completely captivated. They had no idea what to expect next, but they were along for the ride.
And that's the magic of Andy Kaufman.
Yeah.
He understood the power of surprise, of pushing boundaries,
Yeah.
of blurring the lines between reality and fantasy.
Yeah.
And he used those tools to create a comedic style that was both hilarious and deeply unsettling.
Yes.
Both familiar and completely alien.
It's no wonder he's still considered one of the most innovative and influential comedians of all time.
Absolutely. And I think understanding his personality through the lens of the sexual seven Enneagram type can help us appreciate his work on a whole new level.
Totally.
It's like we have a decoder ring for his comedic choices, a way to understand the motivations behind his seemingly random and chaotic behavior.
So for our listeners out there, as we continue our deep dive into Andy Kaufman's world, keep this idea of the sexual seven in mind, because it's a key to understanding not just his comedy, but his entire approach to life and performance.
And as we delve deeper into specific examples of his work, I think you'll start to see how these core traits of the sexual seven, the need for novelty, the aversion to routine, the blurring of reality and fantasy, the grandiosity and exhibition, all played a role in shaping his unique and unforgettable comedic style.
Right, well, let's take a closer look at some of those specific examples, shall we? One thing that really struck me about the source materials analysis is this idea that Kaufman's comedy wasn't just about making people laugh.
Right.
It was almost like he was using humor to explore these deeper truths, about identity, performance, the nature of reality itself.
That's a really astute observation.
Yeah.
And I think that ties back to the sexual seven's inherent, restlessness and their desire to push boundaries.
Yeah.
They're not content with the status quo.
Right.
They're always searching for something more, something deeper, something beyond the surface level.
It's like he was trying to shake people out of their complacency, to make them question their assumptions about the world.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And humor can be a very powerful tool for doing that.
Right.
It allows you to approach sensitive or controversial topics in a way that's, disarming and engaging.
Right.
You can make people laugh while also making them think.
Right.
And that's a rare and valuable gift.
And Kaufman definitely wasn't afraid to make people uncomfortable.
No.
In fact, he seemed to revel in it. That time he read The Great Gatsby aloud to a college audience word for hours on end.
Oh, that's a classic example of Kaufman's unique brand of performance art.
Yeah.
And it speaks to the sexual seven's tendency for verbal performance, which isn't just about telling jokes, but using language to create an experience, to provoke a reaction,
Yeah.
to push the boundaries of what's considered acceptable.
And for those in the audience unfamiliar with the story, he literally read the entire book from cover to cover
Yeah.
without any embellishment or commentary. People were expecting a comedy routine.
Right.
And instead they got, The Great Gatsby.
Imagine sitting there waiting for the punchline that never comes.
Yeah.
It's brilliant, really.
It is.
He took something familiar, something expected, and he turned it on its head.
Totally.
He subverted the audience's expectations and forced them to confront their own assumptions about what constitutes entertainment.
And some people were furious, right?
Of course.
They felt cheated, like he was wasting their time.
Yeah.
But others were captivated.
Yes.
They saw it as a brilliant commentary on the nature of performance, on the expectations we bring to art,
Right.
and on the very idea of what it means to be entertained.
It's like he was asking, what if we strip away all the artifice, all the conventions, and just present something raw, something real, something unexpected? Will you still be entertained? Will you still find meaning in it?
And those are big questions.
They are.
Questions that go beyond the realm of comedy and touch on something deeper,
Yeah.
something more profound about the human experience. It's also interesting to consider how Kaufman's sexual seven traits might have impacted his personal life and relationships.
Oh,
Because these are qualities that can be incredibly attractive and charismatic,
Yeah.
but also challenging to deal with on a day-to-day basis.
I mean, imagine being in a relationship with someone who's constantly seeking out new experiences,
Right.
who's averse to routine,
Yeah.
who blurs the lines between reality and fantasy.
Right.
It would be exhilarating and exhausting all at the same time.
And the source material hints at this, mentioning that Kaufman's personal life was just as unconventional as his career.
Yes, and I think it's important to acknowledge that while the sexual seven's energy and spontaneity can be incredibly appealing,
Yeah.
it can also lead to instability and a lack of commitment.
Right.
They may struggle with monogamy or with settling down into a routine simply because it goes against their very nature.
It's like they're always looking for the next big adventure, the next thrilling experience.
Yeah.
And that can make it difficult to build lasting connections.
And I think that's something that's often overlooked when we talk about the sexual seven.
Yeah.
We focus on their charisma, their charm, their ability to light up a room.
Right.
But we forget that those qualities can also be a double-edged sword.
It's like they're constantly chasing a high, a feeling of excitement and novelty.
Yeah.
And that can lead to a lot of heartache and disappointment, both for themselves and for the people around them.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's worth considering as we continue to explore Kaufman's life and work.
Yeah.
Because it's not just about celebrating his genius,
Right.
it's also about understanding the complexities of his personality,
Mm.
the challenges he faced,
Yeah.
and the impact his choices had on those around him.
So, as we move forward, let's try to keep that in mind.
Right.
To see Kaufman as a whole person with both strengths and weaknesses,
Yeah.
and to appreciate the ways in which his sexual seven traits both fueled his creativity and complicated his life.
I think that's a great approach.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, what makes Kaufman so fascinating is not just his talent or his success, but his humanity.
Right.
He was a flawed, complex, and utterly unique individual who challenged us to think differently about comedy, about performance, and about ourselves.
And that's a legacy worth exploring.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one of the things that strikes me as particularly fascinating is Kaufman's dedication to transcendental meditation.
Oh, yeah.
He practiced for hours every day. He even became a TM teacher.
You know, that's something I was hoping we'd get to.
Yeah.
Because it seems like a bit of a contradiction, right?
Yeah.
On the one hand, you have this incredibly extroverted, flamboyant performer who craves attention and excitement.
Right?
And on the other hand, you have this dedicated meditator who seeks inner peace and tranquility.
It's a fascinating juxtaposition, isn't it?
It really is.
But I think it speaks to the complexity of the sexual seven personality.
Okay.
They're not just surface-level thrill seekers. They're also searching for something deeper, something more meaningful, something that transcends the mundane and connects them to a higher purpose.
So for Kaufman, TM wasn't just about relaxation or stress relief.
Right.
It was a way to connect with something bigger than himself, something that gave his life meaning and purpose.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's often overlooked when we talk about spirituality or self-discovery.
Right.
It's not just about finding peace and quiet.
Yeah.
It's also about finding a source of inspiration and motivation, something that fuels your creativity and gives you a sense of direction.
And for a sexual seven, that can be a powerful thing.
It can.
Because their energy and enthusiasm can sometimes lead them down a lot of different paths, some of which may be more fulfilling than others.
And finding a spiritual practice that grounds them,
Right.
that gives them a sense of center, can be incredibly helpful in navigating those choices and staying true to their authentic selves.
You know, it makes me think about that quote where Kaufman says, "I'm not a comedian, but a song and dance man." It's almost like he was trying to transcend the limitations of a single label to create something that was more expansive, more expressive, more true to his inner vision.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
And I think it speaks to the sexual seven's desire to be seen as more than just one thing.
Right.
They have so many interests, so many passions, that they often resist being pigeonholed or defined by a single role or identity.
And in a way, that's what makes them such compelling performers.
It is.
They're constantly surprising us, challenging our expectations, and pushing the boundaries of what we thought was possible.
And I think that's ultimately what Kaufman did throughout his career.
Yeah.
He used his comedy, his performance art, his very life to explore the depths of human experience and to remind us that there's always more to discover, more to learn, more to create.
And that's a powerful message, one that continues to resonate with audiences today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because in a world that often tries to categorize us, to limit us, to define us, Kaufman dared to be different.
Yeah.
He dared to be himself in all his complexity and contradiction.
And in doing so, he created a legacy that's both hilarious and thought-provoking.
Yeah.
Both entertaining and deeply meaningful.
Speaking of meaningful, the source material refers to the sexual seven as an enchanted charmer.
Oh, yeah.
It's such a perfect way to capture Kaufman's appeal.
Yes. He was so committed to his performances, so fully immersed in his own fantasy world,
Right.
that he became genuinely captivating.
There was something about his authenticity, his genuine belief in what he was doing,
Right.
that made him impossible to ignore, even if he didn't quite understand what he was doing.
It's like he was inviting you to join him on this wild ride, to
Yeah.
suspend your disbelief and enter this world he'd created.
Right.
Whether it was a wrestling ring, a nightclub stage, or a Carnegie Hall filled with confused and delighted audience members.
And, that ability to draw people in, to enchant them, to make them feel like they're part of something special,
Right.
that's a hallmark of the sexual seven's charisma.
But it's not just about charm or charisma.
Right.
It's also about their ability to tap into something deeper, something universal.
Yeah.
It's like they're able to connect with our inner child, that part of us that still believes in magic and possibility.
And that's a powerful thing, especially in a world that can often feel cynical and disillusioning.
Right.
Kaufman reminded us that it's okay to be silly, to be absurd, to
Yeah.
embrace the unexpected.
Yeah.
And in doing so, he opened up a space for us to connect with our own sense of wonder and possibility.
I think that's a really beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
And it makes me wonder, what do you think Kaufman would be doing if he were alive today? How do you think his unique brand of comedy would translate to the modern world?
That's a great question. And
Yeah.
one that's difficult to answer definitively.
Right.
But I think it's safe to say that he would still be pushing boundaries, challenging conventions, and making us laugh in ways we never thought possible.
I mean, think about the internet, social media, all the new platforms for performance and self-expression that exist today.
Right.
Kaufman would have had a field day with those. Oh, absolutely. He would have been a master of viral marketing, of creating these online personas and events that would have captured the public's imagination.
He probably would have had a whole team of people portraying his characters online, blurring the lines between reality and fiction even further.
And just imagine the potential for elaborate pranks and hoaxes.
Oh, yeah.
He could have created these intricate online worlds, these alternate realities that would have drawn people in and left them questioning it, what was real and what wasn't.
It's almost like he was born ahead of his time, a digital pioneer trapped in an analog world.
There's a certain irony to that, isn't it? Because
Yeah.
while Kaufman was so adept at blurring the lines between reality and performance, he was also a staunch advocate for authenticity, for being true to oneself.
You know, that reminds me of something we talked about earlier, this
Yeah.
idea of the sexual seven's capacity for self-suggestion.
Right.
They can become so immersed in their own fantasies, so convinced of their own narratives that it becomes difficult to distinguish between what's real and what's imagined.
Right.
And I think that's where things can get tricky, both for the sexual seven and for the people around them.
Right.
Because while it's great to have a vivid imagination and a strong sense of self-belief, it's also important to have a grounding in reality.
Otherwise, you risk losing yourself in your own fantasies, becoming detached from the real world and the people in it.
And I think that's something that Kaufman struggled with at times.
Yeah.
He was so committed to his performances, to his personas, that it's hard to know where the act ended and the real Andy Kaufman began.
And that's part of what makes him so fascinating, right? This
Yeah.
constant tension between the real and the imagined, the authentic and the fabricated.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that we all grapple with to some extent.
Right.
We all create personas, we all perform roles, we all present different versions of ourselves to the world.
But the question is, how much of that is genuine and how much of it is an act? Where do we draw the line between who we are and who we want to be?
Those are big questions.
Yeah.
And I don't think there are any easy answers.
Yeah. Right.
But I think Kaufman's life and work offer us some valuable insights into the complexities of identity, performance,
Yeah.
and the human desire to connect with something bigger than ourselves.
And perhaps, even more importantly, he reminds us that it's okay to be different, to be unconventional, to embrace the absurdity of life and find humor in the unexpected.
And in a world that often tries to fit us into neat little boxes,
Right.
I think that's a message worth celebrating.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, before we wrap up, there's one more aspect of the sexual seven that I want to touch on,
Okay.
and that's their tendency for impulsiveness and impatience.
Ah, yes. The ever-present need for instant gratification
Right.
and the struggle with delayed rewards.
Yeah.
It's definitely a hallmark of the type.
And it seems like this played out in Kaufman's career well, didn't it?
Yeah.
He had a tendency to, abandon successful formulas,
Right.
to move on to something new as soon as things started to feel too familiar or routine.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Remember that Elvis impression?
Oh, yeah.
Beloved by audiences,
Yeah.
but he didn't want to become a one-trick pony.
Right.
It's almost like he was allergic to repetition.
It's like he was constantly chasing the next creative high, the next challenge, the next opportunity to surprise and delight his audience.
And while that can be incredibly stimulating and productive, it can also lead to a certain level of instability and a lack of follow-through.
Right.
It's the classic dilemma of the sexual seven.
Yeah.
They're brilliant at starting things, but they may struggle with finishing them.
Because the allure of the new, the excitement of the unknown is always beckoning.
It's like they're always looking over the horizon, searching for the next adventure, the next thrill, the next opportunity to experience something extraordinary.
And that can make it difficult to stick with anything for too long,
Yeah.
even if it's something they enjoy and are good at.
It's the classic grass is always greener syndrome.
Right.
And while it can be frustrating for those around them, it's also part of what makes them so dynamic and unpredictable.
You know, it makes me wonder, do you think Kaufman's impulsiveness was ultimately a strength or a weakness? Did it help him achieve his creative goals, or did it hold him back from reaching his full potential?
That's a tough question.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's a simple answer.
Right.
Because on the one hand, his impulsiveness allowed him to take risks, to experiment,
Yeah.
to constantly push the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in comedy.
It gave him the freedom to be spontaneous, to follow his instincts, to create these moments of pure, unadulterated brilliance.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it also led to a certain level of inconsistency,
Right.
a tendency to abandon projects or relationships before they had a chance to fully develop.
It's like he was always chasing the next big thing, the next creative high.
Yeah.
And that sometimes came at the expense of the present moment.
But perhaps that's part of what makes him so enigmatic,
Right.
so enduringly fascinating.
Yeah.
He was a complex individual, full of contradictions, and his impulsiveness was both a gift and a curse.
It's like he was constantly walking a tightrope between brilliance and chaos.
Yeah.
And that's what made his work so thrilling and unpredictable.
And I think that's a legacy worth celebrating.
Yeah.
Because in a world that often values conformity and predictability, Kaufman reminded us that it's okay to be different, to be impulsive,
Right.
to embrace the unknown and let our creative spirits soar.
And who knows, maybe that's the greatest lesson he taught us all.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
And I think it's a lesson that's particularly relevant today in a world that's constantly changing and evolving.
Totally.
We need more people like Kaufman, people who are willing to challenge the status quo, to think outside the box,
Yeah.
and to create something truly unique and unexpected.
Because it's in those moments of surprise, of disruption, of creative chaos that true innovation and progress occur.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And while not all of us may be destined to become comedic legends or performance artists, we can all embrace a little bit of that Kaufman spirit in our own lives.
We can be a little more spontaneous, a little more daring, a little more willing to take risks and follow our creative impulses.
And who knows where those impulses might lead us?
To a Carnegie Hall stage, maybe?
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Or maybe just to a moment of unexpected joy, a flash of inspiration, a new way of seeing the world.
And sometimes that's all it takes to make life a little more interesting, a little more meaningful, a little more Kaufman-esque.
I like that. A little more Kaufman-esque.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to encourage you, our listener, to think about how the sexual 7 traits manifest in your own life or in the lives of people you know.
Right.
Are you drawn to new experiences? Do you struggle with routine and commitment? Do you have a vivid imagination and a tendency to blur the lines between reality and fantasy?
Good questions.
These are all qualities that can be both challenging and rewarding.
Hmm.
And understanding them, both in ourselves and in others, can help us navigate the complexities of life with more compassion and understanding.
And who knows? Maybe it will even inspire you to create something truly unique and extraordinary, something worthy of the Andy Kaufman legacy.
Well said.
Yeah.
Now, before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to take a moment to recap what we've covered so far.
Oh.
We've explored the core traits of the sexual 7 Enneagram type, including their need for novelty, their aversion to routine, their tendency to blur the lines between reality and fantasy, their charisma and charm,
Right.
and their capacity for both grandiosity and impulsiveness.
And we've seen how these traits played out in Andy Kaufman's life and career, shaping his unique comedic style, his unconventional relationships, and his enduring legacy as one of the most innovative and influential performers of all time.
We've also touched on some of the challenges that come with being a sexual 7, including the potential for instability, commitment issues, and a tendency to get lost in one's own fantasies.
Oh.
But despite these challenges, the sexual 7 is a vibrant, creative, and deeply inspiring type. They remind us to embrace the joy and wonder of life, to never stop exploring, and to always be willing to challenge the status quo.
And I think that's a message that's worth remembering as we move forward in our own lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So in the final part of our deep dive, we'll be taking a closer look at some of Kaufman's most iconic performances, analyzing how his sexual 7 traits informed his creative choices and shaped his impact on the world of comedy and performance art.
Right.
We'll also be exploring his legacy, the ways in which his work continues to inspire and influence artists and audiences today,
Yeah.
and what we can learn from his unique approach to life and creativity.
So stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive into the fascinating world of Andy Kaufman, the comedic genius, the enigmatic performer, and the ultimate sexual 7.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about, like, your sexual 7, the Enneagram type, and
Right.
how it, relates to Andy Kaufman, his personality, his career.
Yeah.
But you know what? I think it's time to actually, dive into some specific examples of his work and really see how these traits, like, manifested, in these performances.
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you think?
A great place to start would be his iconic performance on Saturday Night Live
Oh, okay.
back in 1979.
Oh, you mean the one where he, like, lip-synced to the Mighty Mouse theme song?
That's the one.
Yeah.
Now, on the surface, it seems like a simple, almost childish bit.
Right.
But when you consider it through the lens of the sexual seven,
Yeah.
it takes on a whole new layer of meaning.
Okay. I'm intrigued. Like, break it down for me.
Well, first of all, there's the element of surprise.
Right.
Kaufman was known for, subverting expectations,
Oh, yeah.
for refusing to give the audience what they thought they wanted.
Totally.
And this performance was a perfect example of that.
Right. People were expecting a stand-up routine, a series of jokes, something conventionally funny.
Right.
And instead they got, like, this bizarre, almost nonsensical performance of a cartoon theme song.
And that unexpectedness, that willingness to break the rules and defy conventions, is a hallmark of the sexual seven.
Right.
They're not afraid to be different, to stand out, to challenge the status quo.
And it's also worth noting that, like, the Mighty Mouse theme song is incredibly repetitive.
It is.
Almost hypnotic in its simplicity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that plays into another key aspect of the sexual seven,
Okay.
their aversion to boredom.
Right?
They crave novelty, stimulation, excitement.
Right.
And what better way to combat boredom than to create a performance that's so unexpected, so strange,
Yeah.
that it forces the audience to pay attention.
It's like you saying, I'm not going to let you be bored, even if it means being completely ridiculous.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's also a certain element of playfulness to the performance.
Yeah.
It's silly, it's absurd, but it's also strangely joyful.
Right.
And that sense of playfulness, that childlike wonder, is another hallmark of the sexual seven.
It's like they're always looking for the fun in everything, even in the most mundane or unexpected situations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they're not afraid to let their inner child out to play, even on a national stage.
And speaking of letting their inner child out to play, we can't talk about Andy Kaufman without mentioning his wrestling career.
Oh, we have to talk about the wrestling.
It was such a bizarre and unexpected turn.
Right.
But it also seemed to, perfectly encapsulate so many of his sexual seven traits.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, here you have this comedian, this performance artist,
Right.
who decides he wants to be a professional wrestler.
Right.
And not just any wrestler, but the intergender wrestling champion of the world.
It's like something out of a comic book.
Right.
Yeah.
And yet he committed to it fully,
Oh, he did.
creating this elaborate persona,
Yeah.
staging these outrageous matches,
Right.
and even convincing some people that it was all real.
And that speaks to the sexual seven's capacity for self-suggestion, right?
Yes.
Their ability to blur the lines between reality and fantasy.
Yeah,
To the point where it becomes difficult to tell what's real and what's an act.
absolutely.
And it also taps into their grandiosity.
Yes.
Their desire to be larger than life, to create a spectacle, to command attention.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And his wrestling persona allowed him to do all of that and more.
Yeah.
It was a perfect platform for him to express his creativity, his sense of humor, and his unique perspective on the world.
One of the things that always struck me about Kaufman's wrestling matches was his willingness to lose.
Oh, interesting.
He didn't seem to care about winning or losing
Right.
in the traditional sense.
That's right. And that's another interesting aspect of the sexual seven.
Okay.
They're not necessarily motivated by competition or achievement in the same way that other types might be.
Okay.
For them, it's more about the experience itself, the thrill of the challenge,
Yeah.
the opportunity to create something unique and memorable.
It's like they're playing a different game altogether. One where the rules are constantly changing and the only goal is to keep things interesting.
And to keep themselves entertained, of course.
Right.
Remember, the sexual seven has a deep-seated fear of boredom.
Right.
They need to be constantly stimulated, engaged, and amused.
Yeah.
And if that means losing a wrestling match in a spectacular and unexpected way, so be it.
It's almost like he was using the wrestling ring as a stage for his performance art.
Yeah.
A way to explore themes of gender, identity, and the nature of reality itself.
And he did it all with a wink and a smile, never taking himself too seriously.
Right.
Which is another hallmark of his comedic style.
It's like he was saying, I'm going to mess with you, I'm going to make you think, but I'm also going to have a lot of fun doing it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's ultimately what makes Andy Kaufman so enduringly fascinating.
Yeah.
He was a comedic genius, a performance artist, a cultural provocateur, and a genuine enigma.
Totally.
But above all, he was a reminder to never take ourselves too seriously, to embrace the absurdity of life, and to always be open to the unexpected.
And that, I think, is the greatest legacy he could have left behind.
I agree.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Andy Kaufman, I want to leave you with a final thought.
Okay.
The next time you encounter something strange, something unconventional, something that challenges your expectations,
Yeah.
take a moment to appreciate the beauty of the unexpected.
Yes.
Embrace the absurdity,
Absolutely.
question your assumptions,
Yeah.
and maybe even allow yourself to be a little bit enchanted.
Because in a world that often tries to fit us into neat little boxes, it's the outliers, the rule breakers, the Andy Kaufmans of the world, who remind us that true creativity and innovation often lie in the spaces between the lines.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder the mysteries of Andy Kaufman and the enduring power of the sexual seven. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.